There is a world in the Segmentum solar that has been burning for longer than most civilizations have existed. The ash wastes that cover most of its surface carry the chemical residue of 10,000 years of industrial production and 3 separate wars of extinction-scale violence. And the sky above its hive cities is the color of a bruise that never heals, a permanent amber gray that the people who live beneath it have never known to be any other color, and that visitors from other worlds find oppressive within hours of arrival. The equatorial jungles that ring its midsection are the densest and most hostile on any inhabited world in the Imperium, the product of a climate that has been shaped by industrial pollution and the specific interactions of Armageddon's atmosphere with the waste heat from its continent-spanning manufacturum complexes, producing in the equatorial band a growth so thick and so aggressive and so thoroughly occupied by things that will kill you that even the soldiers who train in it for years never develop anything approaching comfort. The hive cities that rise from the ash wastes are among the most impressive structures in the Segmentum solar. They are not beautiful in any conventional sense. They are massive, which is a different thing. Massive in the way that geological features are massive. Massive in the way of things that have accumulated their scale over so many centuries of continuous addition and expansion that the lower levels of the hive have been continuously inhabited and continuously built over for so long that the people living in them have no meaningful memory of what was there before and no particular curiosity about it because the present occupies them entirely. Hive Primaris, Hive Infernus, Hive Volcanus, Hive Tartarus, Hades Hive, Death Mire. These are the great population centers of Armageddon, each one a city mountain rising from the grey dust of the ash wastes, each one housing populations measured in billions, each one a self-contained ecosystem of industry and habitation, and the particular social stratification that hive cities produce when left to develop for long enough without external disruption. The external disruptions when they came to Armageddon were among the worst that any world in the Imperium has ever experienced. This is the history of Armageddon, from its origins before the Imperium as it currently exists, knew it, through the 3 great wars that defined it, to the present state of a world that is simultaneously one of the Imperium's most important strategic assets and one of its most contested killing grounds. It is a history of extraordinary violence and extraordinary resilience, of individuals whose names have entered the permanent record of the Imperium's mythology, of battles so large that entire campaigns within them would qualify as major wars anywhere else, and of a world that has been broken and rebuilt and broken again, and that continues, despite everything, to endure. Close your eyes. We are going back a very long way. To understand what happened to Armageddon, you must first understand what Armageddon is, which requires understanding what it was, which requires going back further than the wars, and further than the hive cities, and further than the Imperium's formal relationship with the world, to the basic physical reality of the planet itself, and why it became what it became. Armageddon is a large world, somewhat larger than the Terran standard that Imperial measurements use as their baseline, orbiting a star in the Segmentum solar at a distance that produces a climate hotter and drier than most inhabited worlds outside the desert world category. The native ecology of Armageddon before the Imperium's industrial processes were applied to it was a biome of vast plains and dense equatorial jungle, a world that supported life in great diversity and with considerable vigor, the kind of world that ecologists would describe as biologically productive and that military planners describe as offering difficult terrain across most of its surface. The equatorial jungle is the most significant surviving element of this pre-industrial ecology, having proved sufficiently robust and sufficiently hostile to human habitation that the millennia of industrial development surrounding it have not been able to eliminate it, only to shape and in some respects intensify it. The jungle adapting to the altered atmospheric conditions of an industrialized world by becoming denser and more aggressive in the specific ways that an ecosystem under pressure adapts when the pressure is not sufficient to destroy it. The ash wastes are what the rest of Armageddon's surface became, not through any single event but through the slow accumulation of industrial output over centuries. The the byproducts of the manufacturum complexes that were established to process the world's considerable mineral wealth settling into the soil and the lower atmosphere and gradually transforming the non-jungle surface from whatever it had been. The records of Armageddon's pre-industrial ecology are incomplete, and the Administratum's historians have not prioritized their recovery into the grey chemical desert that it currently is. The ash wastes are not lifeless. There are organisms that survive in them, small and hardy, and evolved for conditions that would be toxic to anything that developed in a less hostile environment, but they are not the kind of life that affects military operations, except in the specific sense that the chemical composition of the ash waste soil requires space marine armor seals to be maintained at a higher standard than most environments demand, and produces respiratory effects in unprotected human beings that range from unpleasant to fatal depending on the duration of exposure. The climate of the ash wastes is its own category of unpleasant. The temperature variations between day and night are extreme, the ash providing little insulation and the thin atmospheric layer over the wastes offering inadequate buffering against the star's heat during the day and inadequate retention of whatever warmth accumulates during the brief nights. The winds that cross the wastes are laden with chemical particulate and move with a force that is a function of the temperature differentials between the Hive City heat islands and the cooler ash expanses, creating a weather system that is hostile in ways that affect both personnel and equipment, and that requires specific preparation for any force operating in the open outside the Hive City precincts. The Hive Cities themselves are thermally self-sustaining in a way that overrides most of the external climate concerns. The sheer quantity of human beings and industrial processes within a hive generates more heat than the atmospheric and climatic conditions can easily dissipate, creating within the hive structures a microclimate that is warmer and more humid than the ash wastes outside, and that carries its own set of environmental challenges, the air quality within the lower hive levels being a function of the filtration systems installed and maintained by the Adeptus Mechanicus's servants, and the breakdown of those systems over time in the lower levels where maintenance priority is lowest and population density is highest. Hive citizens who live in the lower levels of Armageddon's hives develop respiratory adaptations over generations, their lungs handling particulate loads that would incapacitate an outsider with a tolerance born of lifetimes of exposure and the specific genetic pressures applied to a population living at the edge of what the human body can endure without modification. The equatorial jungle is a separate ecological zone entirely, operating by different rules and at a different tempo from both the ash wastes and the hive cities. It is the oldest part of Armageddon in the sense that it predates the industrial development that created the ash wastes, and it has the specific quality of things that are old and have survived and have developed their survival strategies over a very long time. The trees of the Armageddon jungle are not the trees of other worlds. They are taller and denser and more thoroughly occupied at every level of their canopy by things that live there, and the things that live there have been shaped by an ecology that is itself shaped by the specific conditions of a world that is simultaneously very hot and very chemically contaminated and very geologically active in certain zones. The predators of the Armageddon jungle are among the most capable natural killing machines on any inhabited world in the Imperium. Not because they were engineered to be, but because the environment they developed in required that quality for survival. The ash rivers that run between the hive cities are not rivers in the conventional sense. They are flows of chemically saturated liquid that carry the runoff from the hive city industrial processes and the rainfall that moves across the ash wastes, collecting the chemical load of the surface as they travel and depositing it in the lower lying areas where the rivers pool or drain into the deeper geological formations that underlie the ash. Crossing the ash rivers requires either the appropriate vehicle sealing or the acceptance of significant equipment corrosion and personal health consequences, and the military value of the Ash Rivers as obstacles is consequently considerable. During the wars on Armageddon, control of the Ash River crossings was a tactical priority that appears repeatedly in the operational records, the bridges and ford points over the rivers becoming the subjects of specific campaigns within the larger campaign. Armageddon is also a world of significant strategic value to the Imperium, and this strategic value is the reason for its population and its industrial development, and ultimately the reason it became a target for the specific sequence of invasions that constitute its history. The world's mineral wealth is substantial. Its position in the Segmentum Solar makes it a significant waypoint for supply lines serving the Imperial forces operating throughout the region, and the industrial output of its hive complexes contributes to the Imperium's military-industrial capacity in ways that the Departamento Munitorum has factored into its operational planning for the entire Segmentum. A world of this value in a galaxy, this hostile, is a world that will be fought over. The only question is when, and by whom, and how many times. The answer to that question is 3 times that the Imperium formally acknowledges, and once before that which certain agencies of the Imperium would prefer not to discuss, and the story of all 4 of those events is the story of what Armageddon is. But before the wars, there is an earlier history, one that predates the name Armageddon entirely, one that connects this world to an event so significant in the early history of the Imperium that understanding it changes the weight of everything that happened afterward. The world called Armageddon was not always called Armageddon. This is a fact that the Imperium's formal records acknowledge, and that the Administratum's historical archivists have documented with the thoroughness appropriate to something of this significance, though the documentation has not filtered into the general consciousness of Armageddon's population in any meaningful way, because the population of Armageddon does not particularly concern itself with events that happened before the memory of anyone currently living, and that bear no obvious relation to the daily reality of life in the mid-hive of a war world. The world was once called Ullanor, and Ullanor was the site of perhaps the most significant single military action of the Great Crusade, the campaign that marked the height of the Emperor's direct personal involvement in the reconquest of the galaxy, and the moment when the Primarchs and their legions demonstrated most completely the extraordinary power that the Emperor had created when he made them. The Great Crusade was the Imperium's foundational military project, the decades-long campaign by which the Emperor and his Space Marine legions reunited humanity after the dark ages of the Age of Strife, bringing world after world back into contact with Terra and establishing the structure of the Imperium of Man. The Crusade proceeded outward from Terra in all directions simultaneously, the legions operating across fronts so vast that no single mind could hold the complete operational picture, guided by the Primarchs, whose individual capabilities allowed each to manage a theater of operations that would have overwhelmed any ordinary commander. The Crusade encountered human worlds that had survived the Age of Strife in isolation, each developing its own culture and technology and governance in the long centuries of disconnection, and it also encountered the alien species that had moved into the territories abandoned by humanity during that dark period, filling the spaces left by humanity's withdrawal with their own expansion and exploitation. The Orcs were among the most expansive of these alien occupants. The greenskin species that the Imperium knows collectively as the Orcs had, during the Age of Strife, grown substantially in numbers and territorial reach, their natural tendency toward expansion and warfare finding few obstacles in a galaxy that had temporarily lost its most numerous and militarily capable species. By the time the Great Crusade reached the galactic region that would later be called the Armageddon sector, the Orcs had established themselves as the dominant military force in a significant portion of it, organized under the leadership of the Orc overlord Urk, also known as the Beast of Ullanor in some records, whose Waaagh was large enough and capable enough to constitute a genuine strategic threat to the Crusade's progress. The Ullanor Crusade was the Emperor's response, It was the largest single military operation of the Great Crusade up to that point, a concentration of multiple legions and their primarchs under the direct command of the Emperor himself, converging on Ullanor to break the Orc Empire that had established itself there and eliminate the strategic threat to the Crusade's eastern advance. The scale of what the Emperor committed to Ullanor tells you what he thought of the threat, and what he thought of it was serious enough to justify pulling forces from other fronts and leading the operation personally rather than delegating it to even the most capable of his sons. The Ullanor Crusade proceeded over several months of intense fighting across the surface of the world and in its orbital space. The details of the campaign as recorded in the Librarius of the Imperial Palace are extensive but not entirely consistent across different legion histories, each recording the engagement from the perspective of its own forces and their specific role in the overall operation. What is consistent across the accounts is the scale of the battle, the ferocity of the Orc resistance, and the ultimate outcome, which was the destruction of the Orc Empire of Ullanor and the death of its overlord. After the Ullanor Crusade, the Emperor made a decision that would resonate through the entire subsequent history of the Imperium, a decision that in retrospect looks like one of the pivotal moments of the Great Crusade, even though at the time it was presented and received as a straightforward operational adjustment. He removed himself from direct command of the Crusade and returned to Terra. He gave overall command of the continuing crusade to the Primarch Horus, designating him Warmaster, the first and only holder of that title, the Emperor's right hand and the supreme military commander of the Imperium's forces in the field. The Emperor went back to Terra to work on his secret project beneath the palace, the Webway project that he hoped would give humanity a safe alternative to warp travel that was not subject to the predations of chaos or the dangers of the Immaterium. He left the crusade in Horus's hands, and the crusade continued, and Horus commanded it well for years, and then the chain of events that would become the Horus Heresy began, and the Warmaster's name became the name of the greatest betrayal in human history. All of that happened after Ullanor. The world itself was settled and developed, and named Armageddon in the millennia that followed. The records of its Ullanor past, filed in archives that most people never consult. The ash wastes accumulated, the hive cities grew. The equatorial jungle remained, as it has always remained, indifferent to the human events playing out on the rest of the world's surface. And the strategic value of the world that had been the site of the Great Crusade's greatest triumph made it eventually a target. The first war for Armageddon is the war that the Imperium does not advertise. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It is simply an institutional decision made in the aftermath of an event so theologically and politically destabilizing that the responsible agency, the Inquisition, determined that the benefits of public knowledge were outweighed by the costs and acted accordingly. The war happened. The records of it exist in sealed archives maintained by the Ordo Malleus and accessible to individuals with the appropriate clearance and the appropriate professional reason to access them. It is not forgotten in any total sense. It is simply not discussed in the contexts where ordinary people would encounter it, filed under categories that the general historical record does not surface. The year was 544 of the 41st millennium. Armageddon in that period was a well-established hive world. Its industrial output, a significant contribution to the Segmentum Solar's military-industrial capacity, its population stable, and its governance in the hands of a line of planetary governors who had managed the world for generations, with the particular combination of local authority and imperial accountability that defined planetary governance across the Imperium. The world's defenses were standard for a hive world of its class, the planetary defense force well-equipped and adequately trained, the orbital installations capable of managing the ordinary threat environment of the Segmentum Solar. What came to Armageddon in 544 was not an ordinary threat. The first sign was the warp storms. They came without warning in the way that warp disturbances always come without warning. the transition from stable warp conditions to the churning violence of a storm happening at the speed of the Immaterium's indifference to human schedules and human needs. The storms appeared in the region of space surrounding Armageddon and extended outward to cut the world off from the normal transit routes that connected it to the rest of the Imperium, isolating it in a way that was both practically impeding, preventing the arrival of reinforcements, and psychically significant, the specific character of the warp storms, suggesting to those with the training to read such things that what was generating them was not a natural atmospheric disturbance of the Immaterium, but something with intent, something that was actively creating the storms as a preparatory measure for what would follow. The astropaths on Armageddon screamed and died, not all at once, not in the first moments, but over the hours and days following the appearance of the warp storms. The astropaths of the Armageddon Astropathic Choir began experiencing the specific kind of psychic overload that accompanies proximity to a major warp disturbance, their sensitivity to the Immaterium working against them as the chaos in the warp bled through the barriers between dimensions and directly stimulated their unshielded consciousness. The senior astropath managed to get one coherent distress transmission out before the storms closed completely. The transmission reached the nearest Imperial Navy installation and was assessed as a priority alert requiring immediate investigation. The investigation was already being prepared when the storms prevented anyone from getting through. And then the ships came through the storms. Not ordinary ships. Not Xenos raiders or renegade forces or the usual categories of threat that Hive World Defense Forces were trained and equipped to manage. The ships that came through the warp storms over Armageddon were the ships of the World Eaters, the Chaos Space Marine Legion that had followed the Primarch Angron into the service of Khorne during the Horus Heresy, vessels that had been in the eye of terror for most of the 10,000 years since the Heresy ended, festering and mutating and becoming increasingly aligned with the nature of the Chaos God their master served. Their hulls were wrong. Their silhouettes did not match any ship class in the Imperial Navy's recognition databases. They were covered in the marks of Khorne's favor, the blood-red and brass imagery of the Blood God, and they were already broadcasting on the Vox channels in the incomprehensible screaming cacophony that the World Eaters used as communication in this era, the language of a legion that had largely abandoned the capacity for rational discourse and had replaced it with something that was purely about violence. The orbital defenses of Armageddon engaged immediately because the governor and his military command had been briefed on the existence of Chaos Space Marines, and the appropriate response to their appearance was not one that allowed for extended deliberation. The orbital weapons platforms fired, and the defense craft scrambled, and the World Eaters' ships absorbed the fire and returned it with weapons that should not have existed on ships that size, weapons that had been modified and enhanced and corrupted by decades of warp exposure into something that the Imperial Navy's technical assessors would later describe as operating outside the known parameters of void combat. The orbital defenses fell. Not immediately, not without inflicting significant damage on the World Eaters' fleet, but the outcome of the orbital engagement was never genuinely in doubt because the World Eaters had come with a force sized to the objective, and the objective was to break through the defenses and reach the surface and the ground engagement where their particular capabilities would be maximally effective. They broke through. The drop pods fell, and on the surface of Armageddon, the World Eaters began their work. What the World Eaters did on Armageddon in the first days of the First War is documented in the sealed Ordo Malleus records with a specificity that those records' restricted classification level is in part designed to contain, because the specificity is the kind that, if widely distributed, would have effects on civilian population morale that the Inquisition considers unacceptable for a variety of reasons, some practical and some theological. What can be said without that specificity is that Chaos Space Marines of the World Eaters Legion in a full-scale invasion of a hive world have capacities that ordinary Imperial military forces are not designed to counter, and that the planetary defense force of Armageddon, however well-equipped and adequately trained it was for the ordinary threat environment, was not remotely prepared for what the World Eaters represented. But the World Eaters had not come alone. And alone, by this stage in their history, would not accurately describe what led this invasion. He was there, the Primarch, the Daemon Primarch Angron, the Red Angel, the first and most fully consumed of the Primarchs who had fallen to chaos, who had surrendered so completely to Khorne's will over the 10,000 years since the Heresy that what remained of the being who had been Angron of the World Eaters was primarily a vessel for the blood god's fury rather than a person in any meaningful sense of that word. He had been a being of extraordinary tragedy even before his fall, the Primarch who had been found on a world where he had been forced to fight as a slave gladiator, who had come to the Emperor already scarred and bitter and carrying the cortical implants called the Butcher's Nails that the slavers had put in his skull to make him more aggressive and more capable in the arena. Implants that the Emperor could not remove without killing him, and that drove him toward violence with a constant neurological insistence that he could never fully escape. Angron had never been well. His legion, the 12th, who were originally called the Warhounds before he renamed them the World Eaters, had been made in his image over the decades of the Crusade, the Butcher's Nails spreading through the legion with Angron's active encouragement. Each Marine who received the implants becoming more like their Primarch, more consumed by the need for violence, less able to function within the constraints of a military institution that had other purposes than killing. By the time the Heresy began, the World Eaters were barely a coherent military organization in the doctrinal sense. They were a force of extraordinary destructive capability that required direction by the small number of their members who had not yet taken the nails or who had taken them and still retained enough of themselves to function as officers. After the Heresy, in the Eye of Terror, the World Eaters finished the process that the Heresy had begun. Angron completed his transformation into a Daemon Primarch, fully claimed by Khorne. His physical body replaced by something that was now more warp entity than flesh and that expressed the blood god's nature with a completeness and a power that made him one of the most dangerous individual entities in the galaxy. He had destroyed worlds, not in the sense of causing military defeats from which worlds eventually recovered, but literally destroyed, reduced to uninhabitable ruin by the application of his and his forces' violence. The specific kind of destruction that Khorne favored, which was not the obliteration of fire and plague, but the very personal destruction of killing everything on the surface. He wanted to do this to Armageddon. His presence in the invasion was not a tactical asset in the way that a particularly capable general is a tactical asset. It was the invasion's purpose. The World Eaters had come because Angron wanted to come, wanted the blood and the skulls that a world of Armageddon's population would provide, wanted the specific satisfaction of reducing one of the Imperium's significant worlds to silence and ruin. The ships and the troops and the logistical preparation that the invasion required were the framework around his desire, not the other way around. When Angron descended to the surface of Armageddon, he descended in the way that a Daemon Primarch descends, which is not in a drop pod or a gunship, but through the warp itself, stepping from the immaterium into real space with the casual ease of a being for whom the boundary between dimensions is a matter of preference rather than physical law. He appeared in the ash wastes outside Hive Infernus, which was the city closest to the initial World Eaters landing zones, and therefore the first major population center that would face the full weight of the Legion's assault. His appearance was accompanied by the specific phenomena that accompany the manifestation of a being of his nature and power, reality distorting in his presence, the air itself becoming charged with the psychic signature of Khorne's domain, the blood-red and brass manifestations that marked his patron's influence rippling outward from the point of his arrival. The planetary defense force units in the surrounding area did not survive the encounter. This is recorded matter-of-factly in the sealed reports. They engaged with everything they had, and they inflicted damage, and the damage was irrelevant because what they were engaging with was not simply a very large and very capable warrior, but a being sustained by warp power, whose physical form was not subject to the same constraints as a physical form that derived its existence entirely from real space. The weapons that could have threatened Angron were not in the hands of Armageddon's planetary defense force. The distress signals that Armageddon had managed to get out before the warp storms closed completely had reached, among other destinations, the Space Wolves chapter. The Space Wolves, the sons of Leman Russ, were among the most aggressive and most capable of the Space Marine chapters that existed in the age of the 41st millennium. Their chapter culture built around the specific martial traditions of the feudal death world of Fenris that produced their recruits, and around the warrior psychology of their Primarch, who had been the Emperor's executioner as well as his general, the one sent to discipline those who could not be reasoned with. They were also, at this point in their history, one of the few chapters with any meaningful experience fighting Daemon Primarchs, having fought Angron before in limited engagements that had given them a specific and hard-won understanding of what fighting him required. The Space Wolves came in force. They translated into the Armageddon system through the warp storms with the specific navigation capability that their rune priests provided. The psychic guidance of the chapter's senior psychers, threading a path through the churning immaterium to bring the fleet through damaged but intact. They brought everything they could scramble in the time available. Great companies of space wolves in the grey-blue armor of Fenris, their vehicles and their weapons, and the specific supporting elements of a chapter going to war against the worst thing the galaxy contained. And the Inquisition sent the Grey Knights. This is the fact that the sealed records contain, and that the general historical account does not. The involvement that explains why the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus took such a specific and controlling interest in the aftermath of the First War, that gave them the specific authority to manage what was done with its survivors and its history in the way they managed it. The Grey Knights are the most secret of all Space Marine chapters. The chapter that does not officially exist in the public records of the Adeptus Astartes, whose existence is known only to those with a professional need to know, and whose existence is maintained in secrecy because the Grey Knights are the Imperium's specific instrument against the forces of chaos at their most powerful. The Grey Knights were created by Malcador the Sigillite in the aftermath of the Heresy, specifically to fight what the Heresy had proved needed fighting: demons and demon-aligned entities of the kind that the Horus Heresy had demonstrated were real and present and capable of threatening the Imperium in ways that ordinary Space Marines were not optimally equipped to address. Every Grey Knight is a psyker. Every Grey Knight is trained specifically in demonic combat. Every Grey Knight carries weapons specifically designed for the destruction of warp entities. They were exactly what was needed for Angron, and they came. The battle for Armageddon's surface during the First War lasted approximately one standard Terran year. During that year, the World Eaters occupied significant portions of the ash wastes between the hive cities and pressed against the walls of several of the major hives with a sustained ferocity that the combined efforts of the Planetary Defense Force survivors, the Space Wolves, and the Grey Knights fought to contain rather than immediately eliminate. The Grey Knights concentrated their operations on Angron directly, conducting a campaign against the Daemon Primarch that the records describe in terms of extraordinary violence from both sides, the Grey Knights deploying every technique and every weapon in their specialized arsenal against a being who had been alive for 10,000 years and who had spent most of those years in the warp, becoming more fully an expression of Khorne's will. The Grey Knights' campaign against Angron culminated in a direct engagement in the ash wastes outside Hive Infernus that the Ordo Malleus records designate Operation Damnation, and that produced losses on both sides that the Grey Knights' own historians describe as among the heaviest suffered by the chapter in any single engagement. 12 Grey Knight Grandmasters led the assault against Angron personally. 8 of them died. the remaining 4, coordinating with the surrounding force of space wolves providing suppression against the World Eaters attempting to intervene, maintained the ritual containment that allowed the final action to proceed, the specific technique by which a Daemon Primarch could be driven back into the warp rather than destroyed in the material world, where the latter was functionally impossible. Angron was banished. Not killed in any permanent sense, the nature of a Daemon Primarch making permanent destruction in the material world, something that required conditions that did not exist at Armageddon in that engagement. But driven back into the warp, forced back through the boundary between dimensions, the specific ritual and martial combination that the Grey Knights employed, breaking the focus of his presence in real space and severing the connections that anchored him there long enough for the warp itself to reclaim him. The banishment would last. Not forever. The Chaos Gods did not permit permanent exclusion of their greatest servants, but long enough. Long enough for Armageddon to survive. With Angron gone, the World Eaters campaign lost its organizing purpose. This is a consistent observation in engagements with Khornati forces that lose their leadership, that the specific subordination of tactical purpose to Khorne's requirements for blood and skulls means that the tactical coherence of a Khornate force is often more dependent on the presence of a commanding figure who can channel that requirement into a direction than a comparable Imperial force would be dependent on its commander, because the Imperial force has doctrine and institutional structure that persists without command, while the Khornate force has only the immediate expression of its patron's will, and without something to focus that expression, it tends to diffuse into the undirected violence that the blood god finds satisfying, regardless of strategic outcome. The Space Wolves drove the World Eaters back. Over weeks of grinding combat across the ash wastes, the Space Wolves in their grey armor pressing the World Eaters in their blood red, the ash and the smoke, and the particular violence of 2 forces of enhanced warriors fighting without restraint across a landscape that was already dying from the combination of industrial pollution and military damage. The World Eaters fought with the ferocity that Khorne's gifts produced, individually formidable beyond what even the Space Wolves could easily counter one-on-one, but pressed from all sides by a force that was fighting with tactical coherence and strategic purpose and the specific fury of the Sons of Rus, who had looked upon what was being done to Armageddon and found the appropriate response in their nature. The World Eaters were driven back to their ships. They departed through the warp storms that had covered their arrival, retreating into the Eye of Terror with whatever they had taken from Armageddon. The blood spilled, and the skulls gathered, and the destruction wreaked, which was their form of victory, regardless of the military outcome, because Khorne did not require campaigns to be won in the conventional sense, only that blood be shed and skulls be taken. And Armageddon had provided these in quantity regardless of the eventual military result. Armageddon survived. Its hive cities were damaged, some severely, and the ash wastes between them bore the scars of a year of intensive military operations, and the population losses from the World Eaters' assault and the collateral damage of the defensive campaign were measured in tens of millions at minimum. But the world survived. The hive cities stood. The industrial capacity was damaged but not destroyed. The population, devastated but not eliminated, would rebuild, as populations always rebuild when they are not given the option of not rebuilding. And then the Inquisition arrived. The Ordo Malleus had been monitoring the situation throughout the First War, had been involved in it through the Grey Knights and through the wider network of assets and information channels that the Inquisition maintained across the Imperium. They arrived in force in the aftermath of the World Eaters' withdrawal, not as a relief force or a reconstruction assistance mission, but as an investigative and management body whose mandate extended to controlling the information environment around what had just happened. What they found was a world full of survivors who had experienced things that the Inquisition assessed as incompatible with broad dissemination. The survivors of the First War had seen Angron. They had seen a Daemon Primarch in physical manifestation, had seen what that looked like and felt like and what it did to the world around it. They had seen the Grey Knights, whose existence was a secret that the Ordo Malleus maintained with considerable effort and considerable violence against the effort's detractors. They had experienced a year of sustained assault by Chaos Space Marines, by entities from the warp that the Imperium's official theology acknowledged existed, but whose official description was carefully managed to avoid the specific kind of existential destabilization that detailed personal accounts of encounters with them could produce. They had, in short, information. The Inquisition's decision was characteristic of the Ordo Malleus and of the broader inquisitorial philosophy of managing the information environment around encounters with the most extreme manifestations of chaos. The survivors would be processed. Their memories of specific sensitive elements of the war would be removed through the psychic techniques that the Inquisition specialists had developed over millennia of exactly this kind of operation, techniques that did not damage the survivors' broader cognitive function, but that excised specific memories with a precision that was both impressive and disturbing. The world's records of the conflict would be altered to remove the most sensitive elements, replaced with a version of events that accurately described Armageddon having faced a severe external military threat and having repelled it with the assistance of Space Marines, but that omitted the specific identities and natures of the forces involved in ways that would not alert careful historical analysts to the omission unless they already knew what to look for. The Space Wolves objected. This was not a surprise to the Ordo Malleus, who knew the Space Wolves well enough to have anticipated their reaction and who had prepared for it with the combination of authority and documentation that the Inquisition brought to situations where Astartes objected to inquisitorial decisions. The Space Wolves, under their Wolf Lord Kyril Grimblood, argued with the extraordinary directness that characterizes the Sons of Rus that the survivors of Armageddon had fought for their world and deserved to have that fight remembered, that the people whose memories were being taken were being denied the specific dignity of their own history, that the families who had lost members in the war deserved to know what those members had fought against and how much that fight had mattered. The Inquisition's position was that the Space Wolves did not have the authority, the jurisdiction, or the full understanding of the consequences of alternative courses of action that would be required to override an inquisitorial decision about information management in a case involving demonic incursion. The Space Wolves' position was that the Inquisition could express its position in whatever terms it chose, and that the Space Wolves' response to those terms would be determined by the Space Wolves' own judgment, which the Inquisition did not control and could not override by reference to its own authority. The confrontation between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition in the aftermath of the First War for Armageddon became known in certain circles as the Months of Shame, a period of direct military standoff between a Space Marine chapter and the Inquisition that demonstrated both the limits of inquisitorial authority when pushed against the will of an Adeptus Astartes chapter and the limits of a chapter's ability to translate that will into outcomes when the institutional weight of the Imperium was deployed against it. The standoff ended without the kind of violence that several parties involved in it privately expected, through a negotiated resolution that satisfied neither side fully and that both sides described in their subsequent records with the studied understatement of parties who have agreed not to draw attention to the specific details of what they agreed to. The memory wiping proceeded. The historical records were altered. The First War for Armageddon became one of the Imperium's managed secrets, known to those with access to the relevant Ordo Malleus archives and unknown to the general population of Armageddon and to the wider Imperium's civilian population. The Space Wolves departed from Armageddon carrying their anger with them back to Fenris, an anger that their chapter's culture, which places extraordinary value on remembering the fallen and honoring the dead, would preserve and periodically resurface in the subsequent centuries when the relationship between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition came under stress. Armageddon rebuilt. It was a world that had been through something it did not fully remember, whose population carried the gaps in their memory of the recent past as a kind of psychic wound that expressed itself not in the specific recollections of what had been removed, but in a general quality of trauma that had no narrative to attach to, a wound without a story. The planetary governors who administered the world in the aftermath of the First War managed this population-level trauma with the tools available to them, which were primarily the tools of the ecclesiarchy and the specific comfort that the imperial faith provided to people dealing with experiences that had no other framework to contain them. The hive cities were rebuilt. The planetary defense force was reconstituted and retrained and re-equipped. The ash wastes were crossed by vehicles, and the ash rivers by their bridges, and the equatorial jungle was circumnavigated by the routes through it that the military campaigns had cleared, and that were promptly reclaimed by the jungle's growth within years of the fighting ending. The orbital defenses were restored and enhanced. Armageddon returned to its function as a significant hive world and industrial center in the Segmentum solar, its contribution to the Imperium's military-industrial capacity resuming and eventually exceeding its pre-war levels as the reconstruction investment flowed in. Approximately 300 years passed, and then Ghazghkull Thraka found the world. Before the Second War, there was an orc. Not the species, not the mass of greenskin organisms that constituted the orc presence across the galaxy, but a specific individual within that species who was in the process of becoming something that the Imperium had not encountered in this form since the Great Crusade, an orc of sufficient personal power and sufficient strategic capability to focus the Waaagh energy of millions of orcs into a directed campaign of conquest rather than the undirected expansion that characterized most orc military activity. His name was Ghazghkull Thraka. The name accumulates with repetition in the records of the Second and Third Wars for Armageddon to become something beyond a proper name, to become a category, the way that the names of certain historical figures in any tradition eventually transcend their individual referent and become the name of what they represent. Ghazghkull represents the orc at the height of the species' capabilities. The orc, as a species built for war-producing in this particular individual, an expression of those capabilities that approached the theoretical maximum of what an orc could be. He had been, by his own account as relayed through orc communication channels intercepted by the Inquisition, touched by the orc gods. The orcs have two gods, Gork and Mork, who the theologians of the Imperium assess as actual warp entities generated by the collective psychic field of the orc species, entities that are not as fully articulated as the Chaos gods and not as individually powerful, but that are genuinely real in the sense that their influence on the orc species and on the warp signatures associated with large orc gatherings is measurable and consistent. Gork is brutal but cunning. Mork is cunning but brutal. The distinction is not as clear as the orcs maintain it to be, but the distinction matters to the orcs, and so it is real in the sense that things that matter to those who believe in them are real. Ghazghkull had been critically wounded in a battle early in his career, his skull shattered by a bolt round from an Imperial defender, and the orc mechboy who rebuilt him in the aftermath of that injury had replaced significant portions of his skull with metal plates that enhanced both his physical durability and, according to the records that orc accounts provide and that inquisitorial analysis partially corroborates, his connection to Gork and Mork's psychic presence. He emerged from that reconstruction changed, possessed of a strategic vision that was unusual for an orc, and of a personal power that made him formidable in ways that exceeded even the already considerable formidability of a large and well-established orc war boss. He began to gather followers. His Waaagh began to grow. A Waaagh is not simply an army. It is a psychic phenomenon as much as a military one, the collective energy of the orc species expressed in a directed explosion of expansion and violence, fed and amplified by the fighting itself in a feedback loop that makes large Waaghs grow larger as they fight. the orcs' natural tendency toward conflict and toward growing larger when exposed to conflict, combining with the psychic field generated by the mass of orcs in a state of excited aggression to produce a genuinely self-reinforcing dynamic. A Waaagh grows until it encounters something that can stop it, and the things that can stop a Waaagh of sufficient scale are few and the costs of stopping them high. Ghazghkull's Waaagh reached Armageddon in 941 of the 41st millennium. He had come to the world specifically, not randomly, not as part of the undirected expansion that characterized smaller orc forces. He had learned of Armageddon, learned of its strategic value and its population and its industrial capacity, and the specific qualities of those things had made it the target he chose when his Waaagh had grown large enough to make the attempt viable. Whether the connection between Armageddon and Ullanor, the world that the Great Crusade's defining moment had been fought on, played any role in his selection of it is a question that the records do not definitively answer. What the records do indicate is that Ghazghkull's approach to the Second War for Armageddon showed a degree of strategic sophistication that the orc species was not generally credited with in imperial assessments of the period, an assessment that the Second War would force the Imperium to substantially revise. He did not come alone. His Waaagh carried hundreds of ships, a fleet large enough that the orbital defenses of Armageddon, rebuilt and enhanced after the First War, engaged it for days before the landing forces began their descent, and could not prevent the descent from proceeding. He came with orc forces measured in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from multiple orc tribes that he had either conquered or absorbed into his Waaagh. Each tribe bringing its own specific expertise to the overall force, the specific orc cultural specializations of the Death Skulls and the Evil Suns and the Goths and the Bad Moons and the others represented in his force in proportions that the intelligence assessors of the Imperial Guard's regimental commands would spend significant effort trying to determine during the war that followed. The Second War for Armageddon was different from the first, in almost every respect except the outcome. Where the First War had been the Imperium's secret, fought by the most specialized forces available against the most extreme category of threat, the Second War was a conventional military engagement in the sense that conventional could be applied to a conflict of this scale and intensity, fought by the Imperial Guard and the Space Marines and the Navy and the Planetary Defense Force against an orc Waaagh that was the largest organized orc force the Imperium had faced since the Ullanor Crusade. It was documented, it is in the public record, it is the source of the most celebrated names in Armageddon's history, the Commissar and the War Boss, Yarrick and Ghazghkull, whose names became paired in the records of the Second War and remained paired through the Third War and beyond, in the specific way that great rivals become permanently associated with each other in historical memory. The planetary governor at the time of the Second War was Hermann von Straub, whose name appears in the historical record primarily as a monument to the specific failure mode of hereditary aristocratic governance, the individual who is placed in a position of responsibility not because of any demonstrated capability for that responsibility, but because of the family they were born into and the system of privilege that rewards birth over ability. Von Straub was not prepared for what Ghazghkull brought to Armageddon. This was not entirely his fault, in the sense that the specific scale and sophistication of Ghazghkull's Waaagh exceeded the threat assessments that had been prepared for Armageddon's defense planning, which had been calibrated against the ordinary range of threats faced by a hive world of Armageddon's class, rather than against the specific extraordinary case of a major Waaagh led by an orc of Ghazghkull's capabilities. But it was partly his fault in the more specific sense that his decisions in the early phases of the war made situations that were already difficult significantly worse, and that the pride and the class consciousness that his background produced in him prevented him from taking advice from people who understood what was happening better than he did. The Imperial Guard regiment stationed on Armageddon at the outbreak of the Second War were the Steel Legion, Armageddon's own regiments, armed and equipped and trained in the specific way that Armageddon's industrial capacity and military tradition had shaped over centuries. The Steel Legion were veterans of the local threat environment, comfortable with the ash wastes and the hive city streets and the equatorial jungle in the ways that soldiers are comfortable with the terrain they have trained in, and their equipment reflected the specific demands of those environments, the distinctive gas masks and long coats that the ash waste conditions made practical, the vehicles adapted for operation in chemical-contaminated terrain, the armored fighting vehicles that were the Steel Legion's primary tactical asset, and that the ash wastes were well suited to mass-armored engagement. They were good soldiers. They were among the best soldiers that any Imperial Guard regiment could produce, the products of a culture that valued military service and that had been producing soldiers for generations on a world where military service had always been a meaningful proposition given the recurrent threat environment. But good soldiers and good equipment and a world well suited to armored warfare were not sufficient against Ghazghkull's Waaagh in the opening phases, because the opening phases did not allow the Steel Legion to fight on the terms it was best suited to. Ghazghkull's initial landings were distributed, not concentrated. Rather than committing the bulk of his forces to a single landing zone and driving toward a single objective, he landed across multiple sites simultaneously, creating a distributed tactical situation that required the defending forces to commit to multiple responses before the overall shape of his campaign became clear. This is not how Orc Waaghs typically operate. The typical Orc approach is precisely the concentrated drive, the Waaagh energy directing itself toward the nearest significant objective with a straightforwardness that makes prediction and concentration of defensive forces relatively tractable, albeit at the cost of having to absorb that concentrated drive at the point it reaches. Ghazghkull's distributed approach meant that the defending commanders, including von Straub, were working with an incomplete picture of what they were facing for longer than the opening phases of a conventional Orc assault would have required. The hive cities came under siege. Not all simultaneously, the logistics of the situation precluding simultaneous full investment of every major population center. But in sequence, the Orc forces moving from their distributed landing zones to consolidate around the hive cities that represented the most valuable objectives and the most significant concentrations of Imperial forces. Hive Infernus and Hades Hive were the first to face the full weight of the Orc assault, the geographic distribution of Ghazghkull's initial landings having positioned his major forces in their direction, and the siege of those hives established the character of the war that the Second War would become. Hades Hive. The name appears in every account of the Second War, appears as the locus of the war's decisive moments, appears in the historical record with the weight that comes from being the place where the pivotal things happened. It was not the largest of Armageddon's hive cities, not Hive Primaris with its enormous population and its status as the world's administrative center. It was not the most heavily fortified, not at the outset, but it was where Ghazghkull directed the primary weight of his forces and where the man who would become the defining figure of the Second War made his stand, and those two facts made it the center of everything. Commissar Yarrick. His name is the other name in the paired naming of the Second War, the human half of the rivalry that defined it. He was at the time of the Second War's beginning a relatively senior commissar of the Officio Praefectus, the institution that provided the Imperial Guard with its political officers, whose function was simultaneously to maintain ideological discipline among the Guard's soldiers and to provide the specific kind of aggressive leadership in crisis situations that the Guard's regular officer structure sometimes failed to provide. He had been posted to Armageddon before Ghazghkull's arrival, part of the normal administrative rotation of commissarial personnel across the Imperium's military forces, and the arrival of the Waaagh had placed him in Hades Hive when the siege of that city began. What Yarrick was as a soldier and as a leader is documented in extraordinary detail across the accounts of the Second War. His presence at every critical moment of the Hades Hive siege, making him the point around which the narrative of that siege naturally organizes itself. He was not physically extraordinary in the way that Space Marines are physically extraordinary, not enhanced, not genetically modified, not the product of anything except the training of the Officio Perfectus and whatever qualities he had brought to that training from whatever life he had led before it. But he was, in every account, a figure whose personal presence in extreme situations produced effects on the soldiers around him that exceeded what personal presence in extreme situations normally produces, something in the combination of his certainty and his courage and his specific quality of absolute refusal to countenance any outcome other than resistance that made the soldiers in his vicinity fight harder and hold longer than they would have fought or held without him. The siege of Hades Hive lasted months. The Orc forces under Ghazghkull's direction maintained continuous pressure on the city's defenses, the assault waves cycling in the specific way of a force that had sufficient numbers to maintain constant engagement without ever exhausting its combat strength, always fresh forces replacing those that had expended themselves against the walls. The defenders of Hades Hive were under pressure that would have broken most military forces, the relentlessness of the assault combining with the losses accumulating among the experienced defenders and the resource constraints of a city under siege to produce conditions that the word siege only partially captures. Yarrick was everywhere. This is not a figure of speech. The accounts of the siege from the survivors who subsequently gave testimony to the regimental historians describe him appearing at every point along the walls where the pressure was greatest, moving through the siege lines with a disregard for personal safety that the soldiers around him found both inspiring and alarming, as though the personal danger was simply not a factor in his assessment of where he needed to be. He organized counterattacks from the walls when Orc forces gained footholds on the parapet. He supervised the distribution of ammunition when the supply situation became critical, ensuring that the ammunition went to the sectors where it would do the most tactical good rather than being consumed by the administrative gravity that pulls resources toward where the paperwork flows most easily rather than where the need is most urgent. He executed soldiers who broke in the way that a commissar's authority permitted, and that the specific crisis of a siege under the kind of pressure Hades Hive was experiencing occasionally required, not with relish, not as an end in itself, but as the specific application of the only tool available to arrest a collapse that would have killed everyone behind the point where it started. The story of Yarrick's arm is one of the most reproduced stories of the Second War and warrants telling in the specific detail of its account. In a close assault on the walls of Hades Hive, Yarrick was engaged in direct combat with an Orc warboss, and the warboss tore his arm from his body, a wound that would have been immediately fatal to most people through blood loss and shock, and that should by any reasonable medical assessment have removed Yarrick from the engagement permanently. The wound did not immediately stop Yarrick. This is documented. The accounts are clear that he continued fighting after the loss of his arm, continued directing the defense of the section of wall where the assault was occurring, continued being the Yarrick that the soldiers defending Hades Hive needed him to be, until the combat was over and the Orc assault had been repulsed, and medical attention could be applied to what remained of him. He survived. The medici officers who treated him replaced the lost arm with a power claw salvaged from a captured Orc warboss, a decision that was practical in the specific circumstances of a siege where the medical supplies to produce a more conventional prosthetic were not available, and that Yarrick subsequently chose to maintain as a permanent feature even when more conventional options became available, partly because the power claw was an extremely effective weapon and partly because of the symbolic weight it carried for the soldiers who served under him. The Orc who had taken his arm did not survive the engagement. Yarrick had personally ensured that with the arm he had remaining. The Orcs began to believe in Yarrick. This is the fact about the Second War that the historical records find most striking, and that the cultural analysts of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Officio Perfectus who have studied the engagement have found most instructive. The Orc species, whose relationship with belief and psychic reality is more direct than humanity's, whose Waaagh energy feeds on the perception of strength and the anticipation of a good fight, began to regard Yarrick not simply as a particularly effective defender, but as something approaching what the Orcs understood as a spiritual figure, a being whose power justified his position in the way that Orc cosmology evaluated power as the ultimate justification for any claim to authority or significance. In Orc culture, this was not a derogation or a dismissal. It was an acknowledgement of genuine worth according to the metrics the Orcs applied to everyone. Yarrick was worth fighting. Yarrick made the fight better. Yarrick was, in Orc terms, a worthy enemy, which is the highest compliment available in the Orc cultural lexicon. For Yarrick, this belief had a practical dimension that the Inquisition took considerable interest in analyzing afterward. The Orc psychic field, generated by the collective Waaagh energy of Ghazghkull's forces, interacted with the belief that Yarrick's killing gaze could bring death as a simple expression of his will, in a way that eventually made that belief partially true, the Orc warp energy reinforcing the death stare that the Orcs had come to associate with him in ways that gave it a genuine psychic component it had not previously possessed. Yarrick's bionic eye, a replacement installed after he lost the original in one of the many injuries of the siege, became in Orc perception the specific instrument of this power, and the Orcs' belief in it strong enough to generate a minor but measurable psychic effect was one of the stranger facts in a war that contained many strange facts. Hermann von Straub's role in the Second War was mostly conducted from the considerable distance that his character and his assessment of the situation led him to maintain from the actual fighting. His decisions regarding the overall defense of Armageddon were a consistent source of friction with the military commanders who were actually managing the war. His instructions to the Steel Legion's commanding officers, occasionally countermanding tactical decisions that those officers had made for good reasons that his more distant perspective could not fully appreciate. The specific incident in which he ordered the evacuation of Hades Hive in the middle of the siege, a decision that would have required the abandonment of the city's population and the loss of its strategic value at a critical moment in the siege's course, resulted in a confrontation with Yarrick that ended with Yarrick arresting von Straub under the authority of the Officio Prefectus and assuming direct military command of the Armageddon defense himself. This was legally and institutionally unprecedented and was subsequently approved retroactively by the relevant imperial authorities, who reviewed the situation and determined that von Straub's decisions had constituted a level of negligence that justified the extraordinary measure Yarrick had taken. The Space Marines arrived. The signal that had escaped from Armageddon before the full weight of Ghazghkull's assault had closed the communication channels had reached multiple destinations, and the responses were arriving in sequence as the transit times from different starting points allowed. Several chapters responded, the Angels of Death taking various forms as they translated into the system and joined the defense. The Salamanders brought their specific combination of close-range firepower and care for civilian casualties that their chapter's traditions encoded. The Blood Angels brought their particular ferocity under the control of veterans who had learned to direct, rather than simply express that ferocity. Various other chapters contributed forces, the specific details of their contributions recorded in the chapter histories and in the campaign records of the Steel Legion units they operated alongside. The combination of the Space Marine reinforcements and the Steel Legion and Yarrick's leadership of the overall defense gradually shifted the war's momentum. The shift was not sudden. Wars of this scale and complexity do not shift suddenly. They shift through the accumulation of tactical advantages and the erosion of the opponent's ability to maintain the pressure of their assault, and the shift from Ghazghkull's forces pressing toward the Hive City walls to the Imperial forces being able to think about counterattack rather than simply holding took months of fighting across the ash wastes and within the Hive City perimeters. Ghazghkull was not simply waiting for the momentum to shift, he was fighting with the same engagement in the tactical situation that his strategic vision had enabled him to create, pressing the points where the defense was weakest and pulling forces back from points where the defense had stabilized to concentrate them elsewhere in the specific way of a war boss who understood the campaign as a system rather than as a collection of individual engagements. His operational intelligence, derived from the Orc equivalent of reconnaissance, the big mechs scanning equipment, and the commandos who infiltrated Imperial positions with a stealth capability that the Imperial assessors consistently underrated in their threat briefings, was better than the defenders often realized, and his ability to exploit the gaps that intelligence identified was greater than the stereotype of Orc tactical simplicity suggested. But the momentum did shift. The Hive cities held. The Space Marines' arrival changed the balance of capability in the Ash Waste engagements sufficiently to allow the Steel Legion's armored formations to begin the kind of massed armored counteroffensive in the Ash Wastes that they were best designed for. And the combination of Space Marine power and Steel Legion armor was something that Ghazghkull's forces could not sustain against indefinitely. His Waaagh began to lose the coherence that his presence and his direction had given it, the individual tribe war bosses increasingly pursuing their own tactical preferences rather than coordinating with the overall campaign. The fracturing of Orc command authority that occurred when a Waaagh was pressed hard enough manifesting in the usual way of Orc politics, which was that the war bosses who disagreed with Ghazghkull's direction of the campaign expressed their disagreement through direct physical confrontation. The turning point of the Second War was the engagement at Hades Hive, in which Ghazghkull himself led a direct assault on the Hive's main gate, an assault that represented both his acknowledgement that the campaign's overall momentum had shifted and his specific response to that shift, which was to apply his personal power and the specific military value of his presence to the engagement where the war would be decided. This is what great Orc war bosses do when the campaign is in the balance. They fight. They put themselves at the point where the fighting matters most, and they fight with the full expression of their capability and the full weight of their personal authority over the forces around them. And the effect of this is to transform a military situation that was shifting against them into something that was genuinely in the balance again, because even the combined might of Space Marines and Steel Legion armored formations found fighting Ghazghkull Thraka in person a substantially more demanding proposition than fighting his forces in his absence. Yarrick met him. This was inevitable in the way that stories that have been building toward a specific confrontation are inevitable. The two figures who had defined the Second War on their respective sides finally in direct engagement, the Commissar with his power claw and his bionics and his will, and the war boss with 10 meters of killing machine and the psychic weight of the Waaagh behind him. The engagement between them was not a controlled duel. It was combat in the middle of a massive assault on a fortified position, with forces on both sides fighting all around them, and the accounts of it are fragmented by the chaos of the engagement and the varying vantage points of the witnesses. What the accounts agree on is that Yarrick was taken, that in the course of the engagement, Ghazghkull captured him, that the war boss could have killed him and did not, choosing instead to take him as a prisoner. Why Ghazghkull did not kill Yarrick has been the subject of analysis and speculation since the Second War. The most widely accepted explanation among Imperial analysts is that Ghazghkull's Orc assessment of Yarrick as a worthy enemy made killing him on the battlefield a less satisfying conclusion to their encounter than taking him prisoner. That in Orc terms, a worthy enemy was worth more as an ongoing challenge than as a concluded one. Orc culture did not value the elimination of worthy opponents in the way that strategic logic might suggest it should. It valued the fight, and an opponent worth fighting was an opponent worth keeping available for future fighting. This logic, deeply alien to Imperial military doctrine, was nonetheless the logic that the evidence supported. The capture of Yarrick did not end the Second War in Ghazghkull's favor. This is the detail that the analysis of the war boss's decision to take Yarrick prisoner rather than kill him must account for. The Imperial forces continued fighting. The Space Marines and the Steel Legion and the PDF forces that had been organized under Yarrick's direction continued to press the Orc forces in the Ash Wastes and in the approaches to the Hive cities, and the Orcs, without Ghazghkull's personal presence at the critical engagements, could not maintain the momentum that his leadership had generated. Yarrick escaped from Orc captivity, a story that involves a level of personal violence against his captors that the accounts describe with admiration verging on awe, and returned to the imperial lines, and the Second War continued. The conclusion of the Second War was not the elimination of all Orc forces from Armageddon. That was neither achievable nor the objective. The objective was the destruction of Ghazghkull's Waaagh as a coherent fighting force, the reduction of the Orc presence on Armageddon to a level that the Planetary Defense Force and the Steel Legion could manage without the massive reinforcement that the war had required. That objective was achieved over the months following the campaign's peak intensity, the Orc forces fracturing into the separate tribal elements that Ghazghkull's leadership had unified, and those tribal elements being driven off or destroyed in the subsequent grinding campaign that the Imperial forces conducted with the systematic thoroughness of an institution that had had decades of practice at exactly this kind of post-Waaagh clearance. Ghazghkull escaped. He boarded his flagship with the core of his forces and translated into the warp, departing Armageddon for the Eye of Terror, where, according to the intelligence assessments produced by the Ordo Xenos in the aftermath of the Second War, he would spend the next half-century or more in the specific Orc version of preparation, rebuilding his Waaagh, adding forces, and thinking about Armageddon, and about Yarrick, and about the next time. Armageddon had survived. Again. The costs were higher this time, the fighting more sustained and more destructive than the First War, even by the metrics that could be accurately compared. The Hive City damage more extensive, and the ash waste environmental damage worse from the combination of the Orc forces' movements and the Imperial armored operations and the orbital bombardments that had been required at several points in the campaign. The planetary governor was in inquisitorial custody awaiting tribunal, and the military command had been reorganized under the authority of the Steel Legion's senior surviving general. The Space Marine chapters were withdrawing to their individual responsibilities, the multi-chapter engagement that the crisis had required giving way to the ordinary pattern of chapter deployments as the immediate threat was resolved. The rebuilding began. Armageddon rebuilt. Yarrick rebuilt. His bionics were repaired and upgraded in the aftermath of the Second War. The collection of prosthetics and mechanical enhancements that his career had required accumulating into a physical form that was substantially different from the unaugmented Commissar who had arrived on Armageddon before the war. He had been made into something by the Second War, something that had not quite existed before it, and he understood this with the clarity of a man who had looked at himself honestly in the aftermath of extreme experience and made an accurate assessment of what remained. He remained on Armageddon. He was not done with it. He knew, in the way that people who have experienced what he had experienced and thought about what he had thought about sometimes know things, that Ghazghkull was not done with it either. He waited. He trained. He prepared. He became, in the decades following the Second War, the Armageddon Steel Legion's most important figure, not through holding any formal command position that precluded the ordinary processes of military governance, but through the specific authority that the Second War had given him, the authority of someone who had been there and done the thing and survived it, and was still here and was clearly going to be here when the thing happened again. He was not wrong about the thing happening again. The Third War for Armageddon began in 998 of the 41st millennium with the return of Ghazghkull Thraka. He had been gone for approximately 57 years by imperial reckoning, a period during which the intelligence assessors of the Ordo Xenos had tracked his movements across the galaxy with the incomplete information that tracking an Orc warboss across the breadth of the galaxy provided, which was enough to confirm that he was alive and building his forces, and that the forces he was building were larger than what he had brought to the Second War. The warnings were there. The Ordo Xenos reports were submitted to the appropriate military planning bodies. Armageddon's defenses were updated and strengthened in ways that reflected the specific lessons of the Second War. None of it was enough, not because the preparation was inadequate in good faith, but because Ghazghkull had spent 57 years thinking about the Second War and what had allowed the Imperium to stop him, and how those factors could be addressed, and what he brought to the Third War reflected that thinking in ways that the specific enhancements to Armageddon's defenses did not fully anticipate. The scale of the Third War was different from the Second in the way that the Second had been different from the First. Each successive conflict on Armageddon was larger than the last in terms of forces committed, area of engagement, duration, and the quality of specific tactical and strategic decisions made by the opposing commanders. The Third War committed forces that dwarfed the Second War on both sides, the Imperium mustering a response that drew on dozens of Space Marine chapters and hundreds of Imperial Guard regiments from across the Segmentum Solar, and the Waaagh of Ghazghkull dwarfing his Second War force in numbers that the Imperial assessors struggled to accurately measure because the Orc methods of concealing force size and the Orc capacity for rapid reproduction made accurate counting practically impossible. Over a dozen Space Marine chapters committed forces to the Third War. The Ultramarines sent forces. The Blood Angels came again. The Salamanders came again. The Black Templars, for whom the Third War represented a particular expression of their Crusade ethos, committed to Armageddon with the specific intensity of a chapter whose entire institutional identity was built around exactly this kind of extended campaign. The Angels of Death in their dozens of forms descended on Armageddon's ash wastes and Hive City perimeters with the full weight of the Adeptus Astartes commitment to protecting one of the Imperium's significant worlds from its greatest active threat. Yarrick was there, 60 years older than the Second War, extensively augmented, carrying the weight of everything the Second War had added to him and everything the decades of preparation afterward had developed in him. He was there when Ghazghkull's forces descended, and he was there in the specific way that he had always been there, at the point of greatest danger, directing and inspiring and refusing with every action and every word and every application of his power claw to countenance any outcome other than the one he had been preparing for. He understood Ghazghkull in a way that no other figure on the Imperial side of the Third War could claim to understand him, not just tactically, not just in the analytical sense of having studied the Second War's records and derived from them an understanding of Ghazghkull's tactical preferences. In the deeper sense, that comes from having been taken prisoner by someone and having looked at them from close enough that the specific character of their intelligence and will becomes comprehensible in a way that distance and briefing cannot achieve. He understood that Ghazghkull had come back for Armageddon specifically, and for him specifically, that the personal dimension of their rivalry was real in Ghazghkull's cosmology, even if the specific weight that personal rivalry carried in that cosmology was alien to everything in Yarrick's background and training, and that this understanding was a tactical asset if he used it correctly. The Hive Cities again, the ash wastes again. The equatorial jungle, now with Orc forces establishing themselves in it in numbers that made the jungle combat phase of the Third War a separate and extensive campaign within the larger campaign, the specific horror of fighting in the dense vegetation of Armageddon's jungle against Orc forces that brought their own particular expertise in close and brutal terrain to an environment that was already the most demanding on the planet. The Ash Rivers and their crossings again fought over with the same tactical logic as the Second War, but with larger forces and more sophisticated engineering solutions on both sides. The orbital space again, the naval engagement between Ghazghkull's fleet and the Imperial Navy forces around Armageddon, one of the largest void battles in the Segmentum Solar's recent history. The Third War produced individual engagements whose names have entered the permanent record of Space Marine chapter histories with the weight of defining actions. The Blood Angels at the Mannheim Gap, holding against Orc numbers that made the engagement a testament to what the Sons of Sanguinius could do when the Red Thirst was directed rather than suppressed. The Black Templars' siege of Hive Infernus, conducted with the patient ferocity of a chapter that had been on crusade for centuries and for whom this engagement was continuous with every other engagement in that crusade's history. The Salamanders in the equatorial jungle, where their specific combination of close-range firepower and care for the populations they were protecting made them the right force for a combat environment where the distinction between combat zone and inhabited area was frequently non-existent. And Ghazghkull, moving through the campaign with the specific quality of an orc warboss at the height of his power, personally present at the engagements that mattered most, his physical presence transforming the orc forces around him into something qualitatively different from what they were in his absence. The accounts from Space Marine veterans of the Third War who engaged forces that Ghazghkull was personally leading describe something that went beyond the ordinary tactical effect of a capable commander, a quality of the Waaagh energy in his presence that made the orcs around him fight with an intensity and a focus that exceeded what their individual capabilities would have produced independently. The psychic dimension of the Waaagh was most visible in his immediate presence, and what it looked like from the other side of the battlefield was a green tide that moved with the implacable purpose of something that did not stop because stopping was not available to it. The Third War is still ongoing at the point of this account's composition. This is not rhetorical. The Third War for Armageddon is classified in the Departamento Munitorum's operational records as an active conflict. The forces of the Imperium and the Orc Waaagh engaged in ongoing combat across Armageddon's surface and its surrounding orbital space in a state of warfare that has not achieved the conclusion that either side requires to formally end the engagement. The initial massive phase of the war, the period of full-scale assault and resistance that produced the individual engagements recorded in the Space Marine chapter histories, gave way to a grinding attritional phase that is the specific character of a war that neither side can win quickly, but neither side can afford to lose. Ghazghkull departed again. The specific circumstances of his departure from the Third War's active theatre are recorded differently in different accounts, the Imperial accounts tending toward descriptions of his withdrawal being driven by military pressure, and the Orc accounts, as interpreted by the Ordo Xenos' analysts, describing a voluntary departure in pursuit of a greater Waaagh elsewhere in the galaxy. What is clear is that Ghazghkull left Armageddon while the war was still active, leaving behind a Waaagh that was large enough and sufficiently embedded in the world's surface to continue the war in his absence, and that the war has continued in his absence with the specific character of a conflict that has lost its central organizing genius, but retained the massive forces and the momentum of violence that genius had set in motion. Yarrick pursued him. When the intelligence assessors confirmed that Ghazghkull had left the Armageddon theater, Yarrick did not accept this as the war being concluded in any satisfying sense. He assembled the forces he needed, made the arguments to the appropriate authorities that needed to be made, and departed Armageddon to pursue the Orc warboss across the galaxy. His reasoning was that Ghazghkull loose in the galaxy with the forces he retained was a threat that the Imperium could not afford to leave unaddressed, and that his personal knowledge of Ghazghkull made him the most capable person available to address it. This reasoning was not contested effectively by those with the authority to contest it, partly because the reasoning was sound and partly because arguing with Yarrick in person required a specific kind of commitment to the argument that most people did not have. The pursuit of Ghazghkull by Yarrick across the galaxy is a story that is still in progress at the time of this account, a continuing chapter in a rivalry that has defined both individuals across two wars on the same world and decades of subsequent history. The Inquisition and the relevant military authorities track both parties' movements with the attention appropriate to two of the most significant figures in a conflict that has already cost the Imperium more than any Imperial planning document had factored for. Armageddon, in the current age of the Imperium, is a world at war that has never stopped being at war and that shows no signs of stopping. The Third War's active phase may have passed its peak in terms of the scale of direct engagement between the major committed forces, but the Orc presence on the planet's surface remains substantial. The clearance operations that the Steel Legion and the Space Marine forces conduct across the ash wastes and in the equatorial jungle and in the lower levels of the Hive cities, where Orc infiltration has established itself with a patience that the Orcs' short cultural memory should not have supported, constituting a full-time military commitment that shows no near-term endpoint. The Hive cities have been rebuilt and damaged and rebuilt and damaged again across the sequence of the 3 wars, to the point where their architectural history is a layer cake of construction eras separated by destruction events. The lower levels of the Great Hives containing structures from before the First War, alongside structures built in the rebuilding after the First War, and structures damaged in the Second War and rebuilt afterward, and sections that were never fully rebuilt because the resources required for full reconstruction were redirected to other priorities, and the population simply adapted to habitation in partially destroyed structures in the way that hive populations adapt to whatever conditions their habitat offers. The Steel Legion is larger than it has ever been. The Third War's demands drove a recruitment and training expansion that has produced a Steel Legion of extraordinary size, drawing on Armageddon's population in ways that the world's planetary governor and the Departamento Munitorum have managed, with the specific tension between military need and industrial production capacity that characterizes any world that is simultaneously a major military-industrial asset and a major frontline war zone. The regiments that deployed to the Third War's most intense phases and then returned to Armageddon carry the specific quality of veteran formations that have been through a great deal and know what they are and what they are for, and the new regiments that have been raised from the post-war population carry the stories of their predecessors in the way that military cultures carry the weight of their traditions. Yarrick's image is on the walls of Armageddon. Not literally, though the ecclesiarchy and the propaganda services have placed his image in various contexts across the world's public spaces. He is on the walls in the sense that the specific quality of his resistance in the Second War and the Third has become the organizing narrative of how Armageddon understands itself, the story that the Hive City populations tell themselves about what they are and what they have survived and why they are still here. Armageddon survived because it refused. This is the narrative. This is the story of a world that has been invaded by Daemon Primarchs and Orc warlords, and every category of threat that a hostile galaxy could deploy against it, and that has not yielded, not collapsed, not been overwhelmed, not stopped being Armageddon. The ash wastes still carry the chemical residue of 3 wars' worth of military operations layered over 3 centuries of industrial output. The rivers are more toxic than they were before the First War. The equatorial jungle has expanded in some zones and been devastated in others, the specific pattern of advance and retreat reflecting the military operations that have crossed it, and the Orc establishment within it, and the ongoing clearance operations that the Steel Legion conducts with the grim thoroughness of soldiers who know that the jungle does not stay cleared, but also know that leaving it to the Orcs without regular pressure creates tactical problems that unchecked growth makes significantly worse. Ghazghkull is out there, somewhere in the galaxy, in the Eye of Terror, or in the vast spaces between Imperial-controlled systems, or on some world where his Waaagh is building toward the next stage. Ghazghkull Thraka is thinking about Armageddon. The Ordo Xenos tracks what it can track and assesses what it can assess, and the assessments are not reassuring in the way that assessments of a threat this capable rarely are. He will come back. The second departure was not the end of the relationship between Ghazghkull Thraka and Armageddon any more than the first departure was. The relationship is not over until one of them is. Yarrick is pursuing him. Somewhere in the galaxy, closing the distance with the Orc war boss through a sequence of intelligence work and transit and missed connections and renewed intelligence that constitutes the kind of extended military manhunt that the Imperium has no formal doctrine for, because the specific combination of circumstances that produced it has not previously existed in this form. The old Commissar with his power claw and his bionic eye and his 6 decades of history with Armageddon and with Ghazghkull, pursuing the war boss who let him live once in the knowledge that letting him live was the specific decision that extended their story rather than ending it. The world below their story turns. The ash wastes catch the wind, and the hive cities burn their lumens against the permanent amber sky, and the equatorial jungle grows in its impenetrable density, and the Steel Legion soldiers on their watches look out over the ash and the darkness and hold the line that has been held on this world since the day the first recruits took their first positions on Armageddon's walls. 3 wars. The world that was Ullanor, that became Armageddon, that survived the Daemon Primarch and the first Waaagh and the second Waaagh, and has outlasted everything the galaxy has brought against it on the specific strength of a refusal that is written into the culture of its people and the structure of its institutions and the names on the walls of its great hives, where the fallen are honored in the way that Armageddon has always honored its fallen, which is by continuing to stand. The Astronomicon burns, the hive cities endure, the Steel Legion holds, Armageddon endures. Close your eyes. The ash is still. The watch is kept. The people of Armageddon are not the people of other worlds. This is not a statement about genetic or cultural superiority of the kind that certain species of imperial boosterism produce when applied to military worlds, the reflexive valorization of toughness as a cultural virtue that always risks mistaking the conditions that produce the toughness for something chosen rather than endured. It is a simpler observation that growing up on Armageddon, on a world that has been at war 3 times in living memory, and that exists in a state of continuous low-level conflict, even in the intervals between the great wars, produces people who understand certain things about the nature of existence that people on more peaceful worlds do not understand in the same way. They understand that the walls matter, not as a metaphor, not in the abstract sense that civilization provides protection against the raw hostility of the galaxy, but concretely and specifically, and with the personal knowledge of people who have been close enough to the walls when the walls mattered to understand exactly what they are. The hive city walls of Armageddon are cultural objects as much as military installations. Their presence in the consciousness of the population, they protect a constant reference point that gives the phrase "holding the line" a meaning that residents of other hive worlds who have not experienced a siege cannot fully share. They understand about the Steel Legion in a way that is different from how other imperial populations understand their local regiments. The Steel Legion is not a distant institution that takes young people away from their communities and sends them somewhere else to fight someone else's wars. The Steel Legion fights on Armageddon. The soldiers who join the Steel Legion are fighting for the world they were born on, defending the hive they grew up in some cases defending streets they walked as children and factory levels their families worked in. This specificity of purpose gives the Steel Legion a quality of investment in the outcome of each engagement that formations fighting far from home do not have in the same way, a quality that the regiment's senior officers have always understood, and that the Steel Legion's tactical doctrine has been shaped around: the preference for defensive operations and counterattacks from established positions, reflecting not just the tactical advantages of that approach in the ash waste environment, but the specific motivational reality of soldiers who are fighting for something they can see and name, and whose loss would be personally and immediately catastrophic. The children of the hive mid-levels know the gas mask before they know most other pieces of equipment. The chemical composition of the air in the ash wastes and the lower hive levels makes respiratory protection a practical necessity that the culture has incorporated into its aesthetic in ways that visitors find striking. The gas mask and the long coat and the specific combination of industrial pragmatism and martial readiness that the Steel Legion's uniform represents, having filtered back into the civilian culture as the standard appearance of an Armageddon adult prepared to move through the world. It is protective equipment worn as identity, the specific statement that the people of Armageddon make about who they are by what they wear, which is a statement about being prepared for the worst that their world has to offer and not being surprised by it. The ecclesiarchy on Armageddon has developed, across the centuries of war, a specific variant of the imperial faith that is recognizable as the standard creed, and that is also specifically Armageddon's, shaped by the specific experiences of a population that has asked the God Emperor for protection 3 times and received it 3 times at extraordinary cost. The faith of Armageddon is less concerned with the transcendent theological abstractions that more peaceful worlds' priesthoods emphasize, and more concerned with the immediate and practical, with the protection of the walls, with the sustenance of the soldier in the field, with the specific quality of courage required to stand at a position that is being assaulted and not yield. The ecclesiarchal services on Armageddon are shorter and more direct than the elaborate liturgical productions of some major shrine worlds. Because the congregants of Armageddon's churches do not have the luxury of extended contemplative devotion when the next watch begins in 2 hours, there are children on Armageddon who were born during the Third War and who have never known their world in a state that did not include an active military conflict somewhere on its surface. For these children, the war is not an interruption of ordinary life, but the context within which ordinary life occurs, the background condition against which eating and sleeping and learning and developing the specific human texture of childhood take place. The Administratum's records indicate that the psychological assessments of these wartime-born cohorts show characteristics that the assessors describe as adapted rather than damaged. The specific adaptations, including elevated tolerance for loud noise and sudden movement, reduced startle response, and a quality of situational awareness that manifests as the specific attentiveness of someone who has been continuously reminded that the environment can become dangerous without warning, and who has developed the habit of assessing exits and cover without consciously deciding to do so. The workers who maintain the hive's industrial output in the current period of ongoing conflict do so under conditions that would be considered excessive duress in any peacetime context, and that are simply the conditions of their employment in the current context. The manufacturing complexes that produce the tanks and the vehicles and the ammunition and the weapons that the Steel Legion uses are themselves part of the defended perimeter, their protection a specific element of the military planning that has to balance the value of their output against the cost of the forces required to defend them, because an Armageddon without its industrial capacity is an Armageddon that is harder to defend in the subsequent engagement, and the Orcs have demonstrated across 3 wars an understanding of this calculus that the initial imperial assessments of Orc tactical intelligence had not anticipated. Commissar Yarrick's legacy on the world he is not currently inhabiting is visible in the specific shape of the Steel Legion's culture, in the standards it applies to itself, and the tolerance it has for failure, which is less than most comparable formations, because Yarrick spent decades after the Second War and during the Third establishing a culture in which the consequences of failure were personal and immediate and visible in the way that motivates avoiding failure more effectively than abstract institutional standards. The officers he trained and the officers they trained carry his standards in the way that military cultures carry the standards of their defining figures, in the expectations they apply to their own performance and the expectations they apply to those under their command. The Orcs on Armageddon's surface are a constant. This is the fact about the current state of Armageddon that the strategic assessments find most concerning and most intractable. The Orc presence that the Third War's initial phase left behind, reduced by the clearance operations but not eliminated, has proven persistent in a way that the operational assessors had not fully modeled. Orcs reproduce without the logistical constraints that limit most species' ability to maintain populations in contested environments, their fungal reproduction allowing viable populations to sustain themselves with resource requirements that the ash wastes can actually support if the Orc population in question is willing to fight its food supply for possession of it. The clearance operations are not eliminating the Orc presence, they are managing it, keeping it below the threshold at which it could organize into a force capable of threatening the Hive cities, preventing it from accumulating the specific combination of numbers and leadership that a Waaagh requires to become something more than a distributed nuisance. Whether the Orc population on Armageddon will produce, through its own internal dynamics, a war boss capable of organizing the dispersed tribes into a force that would constitute the fourth war the Armageddon name would be attached to, is a question that the strategic assessors of the Segmentum Solar Command address in their regular briefings with the specific care of people who know that the answer to the question is yes, and that the uncertainty is only in the timing. Armageddon has been invaded 3 times. The factors that made it a target for those invasions, its strategic value and its industrial capacity, and the simple fact of its continued existence as one of the Imperium's significant worlds in a galaxy that is hostile to the significant and the successful, have not diminished. The Orcs have not forgotten it. Whatever Ghazghkull is doing elsewhere in the galaxy, the world that he has invaded twice is not a world he has finished with. Armageddon endures, as it has always endured. The people of the Mid-Hive put on their gas masks and walk to their shifts. The Steel Legion holds its watches on the walls, and in the ash wastes, and in the jungle-clearing corridors. The ecclesiarchal priests deliver their specific direct liturgy to congregations that are smaller than they were before the Third War's worst phases, and that are rebuilding with the specific determination of people who know that rebuilding is what you do when the alternative is yielding. The manufactorum complexes produce their output, and the administratums cogitators process their paperwork, and the planetary governor administers the world with the understanding that the world they are administering is not and has never been a world that can be administered in the ways that more peaceful worlds can be administered, that Armageddon requires a specific approach, a specific quality of readiness and commitment and refusal to be overwhelmed, that its history has proved is the only approach that works. The amber sky does not change. It has been the amber sky for as long as anyone can remember, the permanent bruise-colored product of industrial civilization and 3 wars worth of ordnance and the specific atmospheric chemistry of a world that has been burning in one sense or another for 10,000 years. When people from other worlds comment on it, Armageddon's people look at them with the patient expression of people being told something about their own home that they have always known and that the visitor has just noticed, and they return their gaze to the horizon where the ash wastes extend to whatever the current threat line is, and they watch the way people who have always watched watch, with the specific attentiveness of people who know from experience that the horizon is where things come from. They are still watching, they are always watching. Armageddon endures. The Armageddon Steel Legion is the Imperium's most battle-tested planetary defense formation. This is a claim that several other guard formations would dispute, and that the Departamento Munitorum's formal rankings do not precisely corroborate, because the formal rankings are based on criteria that weight recent operational experience alongside historical performance, and that therefore produce results that are not simply a straightforward measure of total combat experience accumulated, but in the specific sense of a formation that has been continuously engaged in serious military operations for a longer continuous period than almost any comparable unit in the Segmentum Solar. The Steel Legion's claim to the title is difficult to effectively challenge. The Steel Legion's organization reflects the specific demands of Armageddon's fighting environment. Its infantry are equipped for the chemical hazards of the ash wastes with gas masks and sealed body gloves that provide protection against the particulate and toxic atmosphere of extended operations in the wastes, and its armored formations reflect the ash waste environment's specific suitability for mass armored operations in the scale and composition of their vehicle inventories. Lehman Russ battle tanks in numbers that make the Steel Legion's armored divisions among the largest in the Segmentum Solar. Chimera armored personnel carriers for the infantry that moves with and supports the armor. Hellhound flame tanks for the ash waste engagements where the specific dynamics of flamethrower weapons against orc masses are most decisive. basilisk and manticore artillery for the long-range suppression that the open ash wastes make possible and that the siege warfare around the Hive cities requires. The Steel Legion Officer Corps is professional in the specific sense that the word professional carries when applied to a military force that has been running continuously for long enough to develop institutional standards that persist across the turnover of individual officers, the standards that are transmitted through the training system and reinforced by the culture of the formation rather than maintained by the presence of any particular individual. Officers who fail to meet the standards do not persist in the Steel Legion, not because the Steel Legion is particularly brutal about its internal discipline by the standards of Imperial Guard formations generally, but because the standards exist at a level that the operational environment consistently tests, and that failure at is immediately evident in ways that cannot be managed through institutional protection of the incompetent. The junior NCOs are the backbone. This is true of all Imperial Guard formations, and it is particularly true of the Steel Legion, whose three-war history has produced in its non-commissioned officer corps a depth of practical experience that the officer training programs cannot replicate, and that the institutional culture has always understood as the most important element of the formation's combat effectiveness. The Steel Legion Sergeant, who's been through the Third War's active phase, carries a specific kind of authority that is not derived from rank or formal position, but from demonstrated survival of things that the soldiers around them know they need to survive, and that this specific sergeant has already proved they know how to survive. The Steel Legion's relationship with the Space Marine chapters that have fought alongside it on Armageddon across the three wars is one of the more interesting institutional relationships in the Segmentum Solar's military structure. It is not the relationship of equals, the capability differential between a Space Marine and a Steel Legion soldier being too large for the pretense of equality to be sustainable. It is the relationship of professionals from different capability tiers who have been in enough situations together to understand each other's capabilities and limitations with the accuracy that shared operational experience produces. The Steel Legion soldiers who fought alongside the Salamanders in the equatorial jungle during the Third War describe the chapter with the specific warmth reserved for allies who were reliably where they said they would be, and did what they said they would do, and took the protection of the formation's flanks and the protection of the civilian populations in the operational area seriously enough to act on it rather than simply noting it as a consideration. This is a relatively specific form of appreciation targeted at the particular qualities that matter in the specific context of combined arms operations under severe pressure, and it is the kind of appreciation that means more than generic praise. The Third War introduced the Steel Legion to a new category of challenge it had not faced in the same way in the Second War, which was the challenge of sustained jungle operations at scale. The ash wastes and the Hive City environs were the environment the formation had been designed for and had trained in for its entire institutional history. The equatorial jungle was a different problem, one that required adaptation of doctrine and equipment and the specific psychological preparation that operating in very close terrain requires of soldiers who have been trained primarily for the open engagements of the ash wastes. The adaptation was not immediate and not without cost in the initial phases of the jungle campaign, but the Steel Legion's institutional culture, which was accustomed to the requirement to adapt and which had been doing so continuously for the three-war period of its active operational existence, produced in the formation a capacity for doctrinal flexibility that got through the initial adaptation cost more quickly than less tested formations might have managed. The Steel Legion trains continuously. This is perhaps the most important single fact about the current formation, the fact that distinguishes the Steel Legion of the post-Third War period from the Steel Legion of the pre-Second War period in the most practically significant way. The pre-Second War Steel Legion was well trained by the standards applicable to a Hive World Defense Force not currently engaged in active major combat operations, which is a standard that the Second War's opening phases proved was not sufficient for what Ghazghkull brought to the engagement. The post-Third War Steel Legion trains against the specific threat model that the three wars have produced, against Orc forces of the sophistication and scale that Ghazghkull demonstrated, against the specific tactical challenges of the Ash Waste engagements and the Hive City sieges and the jungle combat that the three wars had included. It trains against the possibility of the Fourth War with a seriousness that reflects its understanding of the cost of the previous three. Commissar Yarrick is not here to watch this training, but his influence is present in the standards applied and the culture maintained and the specific quality of the question the Steel Legion asks itself about every decision and every standard and every practice. Is this good enough for what is coming? The answer to that question has driven the Steel Legion to levels of preparation that exceed what any peacetime administrative assessment of requirements would have specified, driven by the institutional memory of what not being good enough meant when the Waaagh arrived and the Hive City walls were tested. The walls will be tested again. Armageddon knows this. The Steel Legion knows this. The answer is not to despair of the testing or to pretend the testing will not come. The answer is to be ready. Armageddon is always ready. Close your eyes. The ash is still. The lumens burn against the amber sky. The Steel Legion holds its watches on the walls and in the wastes and in the jungle where the clearance patrols move through the dense growth with the careful attention of soldiers who know that the growth conceals things and that the things it conceals have been there for a very long time and have not left. The history of Armageddon is not over. It is in the middle. It has always been in the middle. A world does not accumulate three wars of extinction-scale violence and a history that reaches back to the most significant military action of the Great Crusade and arrive at an ending. It simply continues as Armageddon continues, burning and enduring and watching the horizon where the next thing will come from. The Astronomicon burns, the Hive cities endure, the walls stand, Armageddon endures. In the grim darkness of the far future, on a world that has been burning for 10,000 years, the people of Armageddon put on their gas masks and walk to their shifts, and the Steel Legion holds its watches, and the amber sky turns slowly above all of it, and somewhere across the void, Yarrick is closing the distance, and Ghazghkull is building his Waaagh. And the story that is the history of Armageddon is still being written, one war at a time, one name on one wall at a time, one watch held against one more night. Sleep now. We are watching the horizon. The histories of the three wars for Armageddon are full of names. The great names, Yarrick and Ghazghkull, and the chapter masters of the chapters that fought there, and the lord commanders of the guard regiments and the planetary governors whose decisions shaped the conditions under which the fighting occurred. These are the names that the official histories record with appropriate prominence, and that the popular accounts of the war's foreground as the organizing figures around whom the narrative assembles itself. But the records also contain the other names, not in the official histories and not in the popular accounts, but in the regimental logs and the Medicae reports and the Commissariat after-action summaries and the operational diaries of Steel Legion company commanders that the Departmentum Munitorum's archivists have preserved in the way that archivists preserve things without particular regard for prominence or significance, but with the thoroughness of an institution that has learned that the records that seem least significant in the moment of their creation are sometimes the most significant after sufficient time has passed. Sergeant Helver Torvak of the 83rd Armageddon Steel Legion served in the ash wastes between Hades Hive and Hive Volcanus during the Second War's peak engagement phase, and appears in the company diary of her commanding officer as the person who recognized in the pattern of Orc force movements across a 3-day period that the main assault on Hades Hive from the south was a feint, and that the genuine breakthrough attempt was being prepared against the Western Gate. Her assessment, conveyed up the chain of command through channels that were under sufficient pressure at the time that conveying anything up any chain was an achievement, reached the gate commander 40 minutes before the Orc assault began and allowed the redeployment of 2 armored squadrons that the assault's subsequent accounts describe as critical to the gate's survival. Sergeant Torvak is mentioned in the company diary twice. She is not mentioned in the official history. Medici Officer Pren of the 322nd Armageddon Steel Legion is described in the Medici Corps records as having performed 17 consecutive hours of combat surgery in a forward aid station 3 kilometers from the Hades Hive wall during the siege's most intense phase, treating casualties from 3 different companies simultaneously with the assistance of a single Medici orderly and the contents of a forward kit that was resupplied twice during that period, and that was never resupplied with everything it needed. The Medici Corps records indicate that his casualty survival rate during that period, the percentage of soldiers who reached him alive who subsequently survived, was 63%. In the ash waste forward station conditions of the Second War's peak engagement phase, 63% was exceptional. He is mentioned in the Medici Corps records. He is not mentioned in the official history. Bombardier First Class. Tanya Graves of the Armageddon Siege Artillery drove an Earthshaker battery through ash waste terrain that the artillery's operational parameters specified as unsuitable for the vehicle class, in darkness, under sporadic fire from Orc forces that had infiltrated the ash waste area through which the battery needed to pass, to achieve a firing position from which the battery's subsequent 3-hour bombardment disrupted an Orc force concentration that the operational records for that phase of the Second War credit with creating the window that allowed the Steel Legion's first major counter-offensive to proceed. Bombardier Graves received a commendation. She is not mentioned in the official history. Their names are on walls in Hive corridors and manufactorum bays and chapel pillars across the Hive cities where they lived, inscribed by the people who knew them in the specific way that Armageddon's people inscribe the names of those they have lost. Their names on those walls carry the weight of what they did, not in explicit inscription, but in the specific knowledge of the people who put them there, who knew what those people did and why those walls are still standing to put names on. This is also the history of Armageddon, the sergeant who saw the pattern, the Medici officer who stood for 17 hours, the bombardier who drove through the dark, and the tens of thousands of others, the Steel Legion soldiers and the Planetary Defense Force troopers and the Hive workers who became militia when the walls required it, and the ecclesiarchal priests who delivered their direct liturgy under fire, and the ordinary people who were not soldiers but who were on the walls when the walls needed people, and who served in the specific way available to them with the specific courage that Armageddon's culture produced in people who grew up knowing that the walls might need them. Their names are on walls. The walls still stand. Armageddon endures. Every Hive city on Armageddon has walls of names. Not just the reclusiam walls of the ecclesiarchy, and not just the regimental memorial rolls that the Steel Legion maintains in its garrison facilities, but the specific and informal and deeply personal practice that the population of Armageddon's Hive cities developed during the Second War and maintained through the Third, of inscribing the names of the dead on the walls of the places where those people had lived and worked, and where the people who knew them continued to live and work after they were gone. The names are on the interior walls of Hab corridors, and on the surfaces of manufactorum loading bays, and on the pillars of the market areas in the mid-hive levels, and on the walls beside the doors of the ecclesiarchal chapels where the dead had been prayed for. They are written in hands that range from the precise lettering of the educated to the labored but legible effort of someone who could barely write but understood that the writing mattered, inscribed in whatever medium was available, paint and grease, and scratched into the surface itself when nothing else was at hand. The names accumulate. Armageddon has had 3 wars, and the ongoing attrition of the clearance operations, and the ordinary mortality of a Hive world population that lives close to things that can kill it. And the accumulation of names on the walls reflects all of this, layers of inscription going back to the Second War in the older levels of the Hive and continuing in the corridors and bays and chapel walls of the sections that were built or rebuilt after each war. In some sections of the older hives, the walls are so densely inscribed that the individual names have lost their separateness. blending into a texture of remembered loss that covers every surface, and that the people who walk past it daily have learned to see as a pattern rather than a set of individual entries, the way you learn to see the pattern of stars rather than the individual stars in a dense field. Military historians who have studied the Walls of Names tradition on Armageddon describe it as one of the most significant examples of spontaneous memorial culture in the Imperium, and the cultural analysts of the Administratum and the Ecclesiarchy have both produced assessments of its function and significance in the specific context of a population that has experienced repeated massive trauma and that has developed this practice as part of its mechanism for processing that trauma and maintaining the social fabric across the generations who carry it. The Ecclesiarchy's assessment is that the practice is a form of prayer, an ongoing invocation of the dead before the God Emperor whose mercy encompasses all the faithful fallen. The Administratum's assessment is that the practice maintains social cohesion by creating a shared physical record of shared loss that is distributed throughout the inhabited spaces of the hive, rather than concentrated in dedicated memorial sites that require specific acts of visitation, making the remembrance of the fallen a constant ambient feature of daily life, rather than a periodic formal act. Both assessments are probably correct. The practice does both things simultaneously, which is the nature of cultural practices that have been self-selected by a population over decades of genuine need. They do not develop by institutional design, and they do not survive by institutional maintenance. They survive because they meet an actual need, and the need they meet on Armageddon is the need of people who have lost an extraordinary amount and who are embedded in a culture that does not permit surrender to that loss, that requires them to continue functioning and continuing to contribute to the collective effort of a world that is still here, because people like the ones they lost died to keep it here. The names on the walls are the specific acknowledgement that those deaths happened and that those people were real, placed in the spaces of daily life so that they are not separated from the ongoing life that their deaths made possible. Commissar Yarrick's name is on the walls in dozens of inscriptions across the Hive cities. This is notable because Yarrick is alive, or was alive at the time this account was composed, still pursuing Ghazghkull across the galaxy in the ongoing chapter of their rivalry. Hive populations do not typically inscribe the names of the living on their memorial walls. The Yarrick inscriptions are the exception, and the specific quality of the exception tells you something about how Armageddon's population understands him, which is as someone who belongs to the Walls of Names tradition in a way that his survival does not exempt him from. Someone whose connection to the lost and the fallen is so complete that separating him from that record by the technical fact of his continued existence seems wrong to the people who put him there. He is there because he is one of them. One of the people who went through what Armageddon went through and who carries it the way Armageddon carries it. And the walls know this even if the biological status of the person inscribed on them technically places him in a different category. Ghazghkull's name is on the walls too, not in the memorial tradition but in the other tradition, the one that does not have a formal name but that is equally real. The practice of inscribing the names of enemies on the walls in ways that are not memorial but are more like the marking of the thing to be overcome, the naming of what must be defeated written, where it will be seen daily by people who need the reminder of what they are here to resist. His name appears in Old Script and New Script, in faded inscriptions from the Second War and fresh ones from the Third, sometimes alone, and sometimes next to the Steel Legion symbols and the crossed cannons of the artillery and the individual company marks of the regiments that fought him. His name on those walls is not a trophy and not a tribute and not exactly a warning. It is something closer to a promise. We know your name. We have seen you before. We will see you again. We will be ready. The amber sky turns above all of this. The Hive City lumens burn against the permanent overcast that the ash waste chemistry and the equatorial weather patterns and the accumulated industrial output of centuries produce above Armageddon's surface. The equatorial jungle grows at its own pace at the world's midsection, indifferent to the human events on the rest of the surface in the way that old and deeply rooted things are indifferent to the events of those whose timescales are measured in decades rather than millennia. The ash wastes extend their chemical grey expanse between the hive cities, crossed by the ash rivers that carry the runoff of the industrial hive complexes toward the geological formations that absorb them, and on the walls the names remain, added to and never subtracted from. The record of a world that has endured things that should not have been endurable, and that has preserved the memory of what that endurance cost in the most personal and most distributed way available, written by individual hands in individual moments of grief and determination on the surfaces of the places where the ordinary life of the world continues. This is the history of Armageddon, not the battles, though the battles are part of it. Not the commanders and the war bosses and the primarchs and the commissars, though they are part of it. The history is also this: the names on the walls, the people who put them there, the people who walk past them every day on the way to the work that continues because the walls held. The people who are alive on Armageddon today because the people whose names are on the walls died for the walls to hold. 3 wars. The world that was Ullanor, the Daemon Primarch driven back into the warp by the sons of Rus and the warriors whose name is a secret. The first Waaagh turned by the Commissar who would not surrender the siege. The second Waaagh that is not over. The amber sky and the ash wastes and the equatorial jungle and the hive cities and the walls and all the names on all the walls. The Astronomicon burns, the Steel Legion holds, Armageddon endures. Sleep now. You are safe here. We are watching the horizon.